Welcome to our deep dive into the world of nature-based solutions, often abbreviated as NBS. In recent years, this term has gained traction in climate and biodiversity discussions, but what does it really mean? Today, we'll unravel the complex layers behind NBS, exploring its definitions, the controversies it sparks, and its real-world implications. From academic debates to corporate greenwashing, the story of NBS is far from straightforward. Let's begin by understanding why this topic matters for our planet's future. Nature-based solutions, or NBS, refer to actions that protect, manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems to address societal challenges. These challenges include climate change, disaster risk, food and water security, and biodiversity loss. While the term sounds promising, its broadness is both a strength and a weakness. Proponents argue that it highlights the many ways nature supports society, but critics warn that its vagueness can be exploited. As we move forward, we'll see how different actors interpret NBS to suit their own agendas. Meaning of NBS is hotly debated. Academics spend years refining criteria and standards, while corporations may use the term more loosely to enhance their green image. For example, oil companies have created NBS business units, sometimes without aligning with scientific definitions. This flexibility allows powerful actors to shape the narrative, often to their own benefit. The lack of a clear, enforceable definition means NBS can be used to justify a wide range of practices, some genuinely beneficial, others potentially harmful. On one hand, NBS can mobilize support for protecting biodiversity and ecosystems. By packaging diverse practices under one term, advocates hope to attract funding and attention. However, this catch-all approach also creates risks. Practices that harm biodiversity may be hidden under the NBS label, providing cover for activities like continued fossil fuel extraction. The term can become a convenient cloak, masking destructive operations behind a green facade. As we'll see, this tension is central to the ongoing debate. Greenwashing is perhaps the most visible danger of the NBS narrative. Companies may claim to save nature while continuing harmful practices. For instance, an oil company might promote tree planting projects to offset emissions, all while expanding fossil fuel extraction. This duality illustrates how NBS can be manipulated for public relations. The term's ambiguity allows industries to present themselves as environmentally responsible, even when their core activities remain unchanged. Beyond greenwashing, NBS can justify land grabbing and dispossession. Strategies like land-based carbon offsets and fortress conservation often require control over large tracts of land. This can displace indigenous peoples and local communities who have stewarded these lands for generations. The needs of wealthy countries and corporations are prioritized over the rights and livelihoods of those most connected to the land. Equity becomes a central concern in the NBS debate. Key way nature is turned into a solution is through economic valuation. In the climate crisis, ecosystems are often valued only for their carbon content. Trees and soils become tradable assets, repackaged for financial markets. This process, known as financialization, allows carbon-rich lands to be bought, sold, and speculated upon. While this can attract investment, it also risks reducing complex ecosystems to mere commodities, ignoring their broader ecological and cultural value. The concept of net zero emissions is closely tied to NBS. Many governments and corporations pledge to reach net zero by 2050, but the details are often vague. These pledges frequently rely on large-scale carbon removal, either through nature-based or technological means. However, the science shows that simply offsetting emissions is not enough. True net zero requires deep reductions in fossil fuel use, not just balancing emissions with removal. Carbon offsets are a central part of many net zero strategies. The idea is simple. Emissions in one place are canceled out by reductions or removals elsewhere, often through NBS projects like tree planting. However, this approach is controversial. Offsets can create a false sense of progress, allowing continued emissions while claiming climate action. The effectiveness and integrity of offset projects are frequently questioned, especially when they impact local communities. Bring clarity to NBS, organizations like the International Union for Conservation of Nature (IUCN) have developed standards and guidelines. These aim to define what counts as a true NBS and set benchmarks for responsible action. However, the standards are often not specific enough to prevent misuse. As a result, the term remains open to interpretation, and the risk of greenwashing persists. The challenge is to create definitions that are both inclusive and robust. Academics, such as those at Oxford University's Nature-Based Solutions Initiative, offer expanded definitions of NBS. They emphasize working with and enhancing nature to address societal challenges, from climate change to food security. Their approach includes protection, restoration, improved management, and creation of green infrastructure. While these frameworks are comprehensive, they also highlight the difficulty of setting clear boundaries for what qualifies as NBS. BS can take many forms. Protection involves safeguarding existing ecosystems like forests and wetlands. Restoration focuses on rebuilding degraded areas such as coastal reefs or peatlands. Improved management means using better practices on working lands to boost yields and reduce emissions. Creation refers to building new green spaces, especially in urban areas. Each type offers unique benefits, but also comes with its own set of challenges and trade-offs. Policymakers prefer to keep the definition of NBS intentionally vague. The European Union, for example, describes NBS as solutions inspired and supported by nature that provide environmental, social, and economic benefits. This fuzziness allows for flexibility and adaptation to local contexts, but it also opens the door to misuse. Without clear boundaries, almost any project can be labeled as NBS, regardless of its true impact. Though NBS can address many societal challenges, climate change mitigation has become the dominant focus. Most policy discussions and funding prioritize projects that reduce or offset carbon emissions. This emphasis shapes which practices are valued and whose problems NBS are meant to solve. As a result, other important benefits like biodiversity protection or social equity may be sidelined in favor of carbon-centric approaches. Term natural climate solutions (NCS) is often used interchangeably with NBS, but there are differences. NCS specifically refers to conservation and management actions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions from ecosystems and enhance their carbon storage. Examples include reforestation, improved land management, and wetland restoration. While NCS offers a more targeted approach, it too faces challenges of misinterpretation and overestimation of its potential. Widely cited claim is that NBS or NCS could provide about one-third of the global mitigation effort needed by 2030. This figure comes from scientific studies that estimate the potential of various nature-based practices. However, critics argue that these estimates often rely on optimistic assumptions, such as continued fossil fuel emissions and limited mitigation ambition. The real contribution of NBS may be much smaller, especially if we aim for more ambitious climate targets. Percentage contribution of NBS to climate mitigation depends on the total effort required. If the overall mitigation needed is underestimated, NBS appears to play a larger role. Conversely, if the true scale of action is recognized, the relative contribution of NBS shrinks. This highlights the importance of critically examining the assumptions behind such figures and not taking headline numbers at face value. Scientific articles have identified 20 types of NCS for mitigation, including reforestation, avoided forest conversion, improved land management, and wetland restoration. The largest contributions come from protecting and restoring forests. However, the effectiveness of these practices varies, and their implementation often faces social, ecological, and economic barriers. Not all NCS are created equal, and context matters greatly. One of the most high-profile NBS projects is the Trillion Trees Initiative, which aims to plant 1 trillion trees worldwide. While tree planting can sequester carbon and provide other benefits, large-scale efforts raise concerns about ecological impacts, land use conflicts, and long-term effectiveness. Planting trees is not a silver bullet. Success depends on the right species, locations, and management practices. Fossil fuel companies have shown growing interest in NBS, launching new business units and investing in projects like tree planting and carbon farming. For example, Shell and Total have both started nature-based solutions divisions. These efforts are often promoted as part of their net zero strategies, but critics argue that they serve more as public relations tools than genuine climate solutions. The risk of greenwashing remains high. Shell defines NBS as projects that protect, transform, or restore land. The company invests in tree planting and carbon farming both to offset its own emissions and to sell carbon credits to customers. While these projects can provide some benefits, they do not address the root problem: continued fossil fuel extraction and use. Offsetting emissions with NBS is not the same as decarbonization. Framing nature as a solution raises important questions. Whose problems are being solved? Who decides which lands and ecosystems are used for NBS projects? Often the voices of indigenous peoples and local communities are marginalized, even though they are the primary stewards of biodiversity. This power imbalance can lead to dispossession and loss of rights for those most affected. Indigenous peoples and local communities have managed and protected forests for generations. Their lands store vast amounts of carbon and support rich biodiversity. However, when forests are reframed as natural climate solutions, there's a risk that these lands will be appropriated for carbon markets, often without the consent or benefit of their traditional stewards. Ensuring equity and justice is essential in any NBS strategy. The Paris Agreement aims to balance greenhouse gas emissions and removals by mid-century. This has led to a surge in net zero pledges, with many relying on NBS for carbon removal. However, the details of how these pledges will be achieved are often unclear. Many plans assume large-scale removals, but the scientific reality is that nature's capacity is limited. Deep emissions reductions are still necessary. Carbon sinks such as forests, soils, and oceans remove and store carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. However, the storage is often temporary. Carbon can be released back into the atmosphere through processes like deforestation, wildfires, or ecosystem degradation. This makes relying on natural sinks for permanent carbon removal problematic, especially as climate change increases the risk of reversals. Key scientific issue is the difference between fossil carbon and terrestrial carbon. Fossil carbon, released by burning coal, oil, and gas, was stored underground for millions of years. Once released, it remains in the atmosphere for centuries. Terrestrial carbon cycles more quickly between land, ocean, and atmosphere. Balancing fossil emissions with natural removals is fundamentally flawed. True climate action requires reducing fossil fuel use to near zero. Current global carbon dioxide emissions are around 43 gigatons per year. Terrestrial ecosystems absorb about 11.3 gigatons, providing a net sink of 4.7 gigatons. However, as temperatures rise, these sinks may weaken or even become sources of emissions. The land area required for large-scale carbon sequestration is enormous. Restoring enough forest to sequester just 2 gigatons per year would require land twice the size of India. Scientific analyses suggest that nature can provide about 10 gigatons of mitigation per year, split between avoided emissions and carbon sequestration. However, the demand for offsets from sectors like aviation alone could consume much of this capacity. If every net zero pledge relies on NBS, we would need several planets' worth of forests and ecosystems. This highlights the urgent need to prioritize emissions reductions over offset. As the limits of nature-based removals become clear, some advocate for technological solutions like geoengineering. These include direct air capture and enhanced weathering. However, such technologies are not yet viable at scale and carry significant risks for biodiversity and local communities. The push for geoengineering often emerges when NBS are overpromised and underdeliver. Only real way to stop climate change is to stop burning fossil fuels. While natural sinks play a role, they are not a substitute for deep decarbonization. Achieving net zero requires massive reductions in emissions, with NBS filling only a small remaining gap. Removals cannot offset continued emissions, both decarbonization and sequestration are necessary. There are two ways to approach net zero. The first, Paris-aligned strategy, reduces emissions as much as possible and uses limited removals for the rest. The second, offsetting strategy, assumes emissions can continue as long as they are offset elsewhere. The latter is dangerous and unrealistic, as it overestimates nature's capacity and delays real action. Understanding the math behind net zero is crucial for effective climate policy. Net zero pledges often focus on the net rather than the zero. This provides a smokescreen for inaction, allowing governments and corporations to delay real emissions cuts. Adding nature to the mix makes pledges more attractive but also more deceptive. Carbon offset markets are used to buy credits, often with little transparency or accountability. The result is a system that can obscure rather than solve the climate crisis. Climate policy, residual emissions are those that are extremely difficult to eliminate, such as some agricultural emissions. Ideally, limited NBS removals would be used to compensate for these. However, many industries label large portions of their emissions as residual to avoid making real cuts. This misuse of terminology further undermines the integrity of net zero strategies. The term carbon colonialism describes how powerful actors use NBS and carbon markets to appropriate land and resources, often at the expense of local communities. By framing emissions as offsetable, wealthy countries and corporations shift the burden onto others, perpetuating global inequalities. Addressing carbon colonialism requires centering justice and local rights in all NBS initiatives. Effective policy is essential to ensure that NBS deliver real benefits for climate, biodiversity, and people. This means setting clear definitions, robust standards, and strong safeguards for rights and equity. Policymakers must resist the temptation to rely on offsets and instead prioritize deep emissions reductions. Only then can NBS play a meaningful role in addressing the climate and biodiversity crises. NBS sit at the intersection of climate and biodiversity policy. While they offer opportunities to address both crises, they also highlight the tensions between different goals. For example, a project that maximizes carbon storage may not always support biodiversity or local livelihoods. Integrating climate and biodiversity governance is crucial for holistic, just, and effective solutions. Financing for NBS and conservation is growing, but it often comes with strings attached. Investments may prioritize carbon outcomes over other values, and financial mechanisms can reinforce existing inequalities. Ensuring that funding supports genuine conservation and benefits local communities is a key challenge for the future of NBS. As the pressure to meet climate targets grows, some advocate for geoengineering solutions. These include large-scale interventions in the Earth systems, such as solar radiation management or ocean fertilization. However, these approaches carry significant risks for biodiversity, ecosystems, and human rights. The debate over geoengineering underscores the need for precaution and robust governance. Equity is at the heart of the NBS debate. Powerful actors often control the narrative and resources, while those most affected, indigenous peoples, local communities, and marginalized groups, have the least say. Ensuring fair participation, benefit sharing, and respect for rights is essential for the legitimacy and success of NBS. NBS can provide a range of benefits beyond carbon sequestration, including biodiversity conservation, water regulation, disaster risk reduction, and improved livelihoods. Recognizing and valuing these co-benefits is crucial for designing effective and just NBS projects. A narrow focus on carbon alone risks missing the bigger picture. Transparency is vital for building trust in NBS. This means clear reporting on project impacts, carbon accounting, and benefit sharing. Without transparency, it is difficult to assess whether NBS are delivering on their promises or simply serving as greenwashing tools. Open data and independent verification are key components of credible NBS initiatives. Past experiences with conservation, carbon markets, and development projects offer valuable lessons for NBS. These include the importance of community engagement, adaptive management, and long-term monitoring. Avoiding past mistakes and building on successes will help ensure that NBS deliver real, lasting benefits for people and the planet. As NBS continue to gain attention, it is important to move forward with caution. This means critically assessing claims, setting robust standards, and centering justice and equity. NBS are not a panacea, but with the right safeguards, they can play a valuable role in addressing the climate and biodiversity crises. Nature-based solutions are part of a larger conversation about how society values and interacts with the natural world. The choices we make today will shape the future of our planet. By prioritizing deep emissions reductions, respecting rights, and valuing all of nature's benefits, we can ensure that NBS contribute to a just and sustainable future. In conclusion, nature-based solutions offer both promise and peril. Their potential to address climate and biodiversity crises is real, but only if implemented with integrity, transparency, and justice. As we move forward, let's remember that true solutions require more than catchy labels. They demand real action, deep transformation, and respect for all life on Earth.